Hello, my quilting friends. My name is Leah Day, and welcome back to the Leaf Peepers Quilt Along. Today we're finishing up our quilt by quilting the background. This is a space that really is actually the biggest on any quilt. It's a lot of area to fill, and sometimes it can be a little overwhelming. So let's get started. I'm going to show you how I'm going to break up the space into smaller pieces and quilt it with a combination of ruler foot quilting and free motion quilting. So now let's talk about quilting the background, and there are so many different ways you could quilt this background. You could put a border design in here, you can get a stencil, you could put, there's a lot of space in here around the blocks where you could fit different designs, different motifs, and really have a ball with different designs. I decided to go with something fairly simple. I wanted to break up the space a little bit and then leave space where if I wanted to change up designs, if I really wanted to play with different textures, then I could, or I could quilt it with one single design. And here's what this ended up looking like whenever I quilted it on the square version of the quilt. So here you can see I actually did horizontal lines and vertical lines because the quilt was a square, and I just used one design, sharp stippling, to fill in all of that background. And I really love how this came out. Not only was it fairly quick to quilt, it also covered it with a really nice texture. The straight lines add a nice interest. They go along well with those blocks. And the sharp stippling, that kind of flamey texture, really goes well with the theme of the quilt as well. So that's what I'm going to end up using in the background of this table runner as well. And I've decided to just stick with straight lines going across the blocks like this. Now to get started, all you're going to need is a long ruler. You're going to measure over the block and figure out where the midpoint of the block is. And that can be a seam line, like on this green block, then that's a seam line running right here through the middle. On other blocks like this one, block number 3, there's no seam line. You just kind of want to measure through the middle of that set of half square triangles, and that's the midpoint in that situation. So keep that in mind. Sometimes it lines up with a seam and sometimes it doesn't. So I started out by marking that line, and then I measured over a half of an inch because I want quarter inch because I want half-inch spacing. So I first had to measure over a quarter inch, and then from there I could measure and mark half-inch spacing all the way down. Now if you're quilting with a walking foot, you pretty much only need to mark a few lines, and then you can just use the edge of your walking foot or a guide bar on your walking foot to be able to do that spacing. If you're doing regular free motion quilting, then you'll need to mark every single line because there isn't a guide on a regular darning foot. Now I decided to use ruler foot quilting again, and all I'm doing to prep up the blocks, because the ruler allows me to do that spacing super easily based on the lines on the ruler, all I needed to do was mark that line, marking the center point of the block nice and straight across. So what you want to do is line up your ruler and make sure the edge of your ruler is lined up with a seam line or something straight somewhere on the block. It's nice and straight, and it's also nice and straight going this way as well. And this is fabric and it does squish and wiggle a little bit. So, you can kind of tweak it a little bit until it's nice and straight, and then mark that line. So that's all the prep that I have to do for ruler foot quilting. Let's move the quilt to the machine and we'll start stitching these straight lines together. So I want to get to my straight line quilting, but first I needed to knock out this echo ditching along the outside of my leaf shapes. And this works the exact same way as the echo ditching before in the sections inside of the leaves, but you might want to do just a little bit of marking. Basically, I took the ruler, placed it on the outside edge of that shape, and drew just a little line right here on the corner. What that's doing is it's guiding my direction change so I don't undershoot or overshoot. Sometimes it's just hard to see exactly where you need to drop your needle and then move your ruler to go along this side. And it just saves you some time. I overshot it 2 or 3 times before I just grabbed a marking pencil and marked all of those little spots. So there you can see that marked line just really helped to guide that direction change. And I'm just coming in on the end. And I have noticed my machine is being just a little bit particular about the direction I'm stitching in, which is why I'm doing a little rotate here. And it also really is easier to see when you can guide the ruler through. And it looks like I just need to do a few stitches here to connect with where I started. So there we go. That's how you do that outer echo ditching. I'm going to break my thread, and we'll shift over and knock out those straight lines. So our goal is to create lines that are 1/2 inch spaced apart. So what we're going to do, working off of a center marked line, is we're first going to space out 1/4 inch, and then everything after that will be spaced out 1/2 inch. And that just ensures your center channel, you go 1/4 inch on either side, that's a 1/2 inch center channel, and then everything else will get spaced out nicely from there. So what I'm doing is lining up the edge of that ruler with that entire marked line, so it's nice and straight. And then just press firmly. And remember, I like to have the ruler in my left hand, at least when I'm quilting on my home machine. On my long arm, it's just a little bit different, but on my home machine, I like it in my left hand. I have a little bit more space on that side of the machine. I have a lot more space on that side of the machine. And so it just feels a little bit more comfortable, I think, mostly because of the space. So now I'm going to line up, just looking over and around the machine to see that that's lined up nicely. And what I'm lining up in this case is I'm lining up that previous line of stitching, that nice straight line of stitching, with the second mark on the ruler. So it's one mark over from the edge, and I'm just lining that up and stitching straight back. And then if you need to, stop and reposition the ruler, shift it backward, just smooth and evenly. And that's the nice thing, is you can do lots of different positions, and you could also line up, and there's a second mark from the edge on the ruler. So that's a 1/2 inch plus the 1/4 inch that's on the ruler foot. That would be 3/4 inch spacing. So you can do lots of different things. If you wanted wider spaced lines, can really be creative with that. So don't feel like you have to just do the same spacing for each set of lines. You can really mix it up. So here I travel stitched over, and then now I'm pressing firmly and gently guiding the quilt through the machine. And you'll want to get a pattern so you don't stitch the wrong number of lines. I'm doing 6 lines to one side of the center and then 6 lines to the other side of the center. So my pattern is, basically down to the edge of the quilt, down to the batting, and then back up to the quilt 3 times. And that'll be a total of 6 lines on this side. The trickiest part I've seen so far has been the stops and starts, because you're going to have to stop and reposition the ruler at least a little bit along that line. It just can get pretty long, especially on some of the other blocks. So the best thing to do is just do that repositioning. Just try not to stop and run your needle up and down. If you've stopped moving your hands, make sure to stop running your machine. Take your hands or your foot off the foot pedal, so that way you're not running the machine unless you're pushing the quilt. And we can also try quilting with our start-stop button. So I'm going to lower my speed down to the slowest setting, and I'm going to hit the start button. And of course that's going to mean that I'm going to really slow down my movement here. But I can do this without my foot pedal, just by using the start-stop button on the machine. And then once this gets comfortable, of course, you could increase your speed. But I have found, when you hit that start and stop button and you have your machine cranked up to the highest speed, it can be a little scary. And here I'm trying to run it and reposition at the same time. Let's see if this is going to actually work. Yeah, this is really one of the few times I've tried the start-stop button. It's good to experiment with, though. So I'm just gently guiding the quilt backwards, and I'm also keeping that ruler foot in position. You can see how I'm trying to keep a consistent movement on my hands, but I'm going to have to stop because I got to reposition that ruler back. There we go. Okay, now I'm going to go back to pressing my foot pedal. And I need to increase my... Actually, let's try the start-stop button, but on a medium speed, and just see how that works. That feels just a little bit better. Gonna still have to stop, though, whenever I need to do travel stitching, that's always going to be, you're always going to need to go slow on that. All right, so let's count our lines. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that's all the lines that we need to do to one side. And it can get, you know, I find that really pretty relaxing. So it's real easy to just keep on going. So you might want to keep a count on it or just mark roughly where that last line's going to go, and that might help. Now I'm travel stitching. I'm using that ruler just to keep me on that line of echo ditching nicely. And stitch all the way down and over and back to the opposite side of that center marked line. So now I'm 1/4 inch from that center mark line. So hopefully you can see how this works. By stitching 1/4 inch to either side of the center line, you've got your 1/2 inch spacing in the middle, and then everything after that is 1/2 inch. So this is the way to make sure that your lines are centered up with the block, and they're going to look really nice over that quilt. There we go. Now I'm lining up. This time my ruler's on the opposite side. I'm lining up that edge of the ruler with that marked line. Stitch on down. Just slow and steady. And whenever you know that you're kind of using the ruler on the side that feels a little uncomfortable, just, you know, pay more attention, go a little slower. Don't feel like you've got to rush it. You know, it's going to feel just ever so slightly more comfortable on one side than the other. And then watch out for slipping. You really want to make sure that that ruler, those lines on the ruler, stay perfectly lined up with that line of that next line of stitching in order to make your next set of lines. So there we go. That is how I'm going to just continue travel stitching over and then using my ruler, just lining up that second line on my ruler with that line I just stitched, lining it all up, carefully guiding it through the machine. I'm just going to continue doing that until I have all 12 lines stitched. I'll meet you back here whenever we begin filling in the rest of the background with sharp stippling. So here's what the quilt looks like at this stage. I finished quilting those straight lines right across, and I did green thread around the red block, and I did orange thread around this orange block, and red thread around the yellow block, and yellow thread around the green block. So you can see I really mixed it up and threw lots of different colors at this quilt, and I think it's just absolutely perfect for fall. But after I got to this stage, I kind of felt like it needed to be broken up even more. So what I decided to add was some curvy lines here on the border. So this is more ruler foot quilting. So to do those curving lines, I'm going to use the mini slide ruler, and you can see it's got these nice etched lines down the back. And this is a continual line ruler, which means that this curve can repeat. If you stop 1/4 inch from the ends of the ruler, then the curve is going to repeat down the line. Also, you have the same curve on the right and the left sides, so that if you ever need to flip the curve, you can. So all of those things go into the design of the ruler and why it's going to work so well for this. So what you're going to do is go to your border, and you've got a seam line for your border where you attached it, and you've also got a seam line where these blocks came together. You're going to line up this ruler, so you're lining up basically the third line from the edge, and over here it's only the first line from the edge because this is a curve. It widens out in the middle, so from the middle you're going to count down 3. From the sides you'll just count down 1. Line that up right on that seam line. We're going to attach our ruler foot and quilt right along it. And for this very first line of quilting, you are going to start in the center. So we'll start in the center and work our way to both sides for this first line of quilting. And the reason being, that's kind of like your foundation, that's kind of your baseline. All the lines afterwards, we can just simply use the ruler, use your ruler foot in order to echo those lines. Now, if you don't want to do ruler foot quilting and you don't want to mess with that, you can take this exact same ruler and simply mark those lines on your quilt instead. So let's move to the machine and learn how to stitch these beautiful curving lines together. So you can see I have already stitched one of those curving lines of quilting, and I'm just going to drop my needle down, bring it all the way back up to the point where the needle is starting to drop back down again. That's when you tug on that top thread And that brings up a loop. That's your bobbin thread. And make sure, remember, always do that when your foot is in the down position, because if that foot's up, it's going to be a bad thing for your machine. All right, here we go. We're going to line up the line that's one from the edge with the seam line between those blocks right in the middle of the quilt. We're also lining up the straight line, which is 3 lines from the edge of the curve in its deepest point. So we're lining up both things with seam lines on the quilt. So now I want to get a good grip of the ruler. I also want to get a good grip of the quilt because I'm pushing both the ruler and the quilt, all of it evenly, steadily through the machine. You're probably going to have to stop and reposition your hands, unroll the quilt a little bit. I've kind of rolled the quilt up here right in front of me on the table. So you'll probably have to stop and reposition halfway through. Just make sure it doesn't slip, especially with this first line of quilting. You really want this first line of quilting to be nice and smooth. Okay, so you're going to stitch to the line that is 1 from the edge, which is basically 1/4 inch from the edge, and you're going to stop on that line, and that's when you're going to reposition the ruler. So here we go. I'm repositioning it, and basically I'm just kind of eyeballing and placing that line 1/4 inch from the edge I'm lining that up with my needle. I'm lining up that straight line, which is 3 from the edge here, and lining that up with the seam line too. And then once I get it all lined up and happy, that's when I push the quilt evenly through the machine. Now what happens if your ruler slips, like mine just slipped kind of way out over here? What do? Well, you're just going to have to kind of eyeball it. Place the ruler so that you've got that line, which is in the middle, 3 from the edge, or down here, 1 from the edge. Place that on the seam line, and then just try and figure out where you are in that curve. And so here we go. I'm just sliding the ruler down that curve, or down along the side of the ruler foot, because the ruler foot hasn't moved, just the ruler has moved. And once it's all lined up again, then you can get back to stitching. There we go. And then again, stop, needle in the down position on that mark 1/4 inch from the edge, and then line it up again and stitch it again. You want to avoid having, hesitation knots and just basically stopping and stitching in place. That's where, it might just be that maybe your hands are just getting comfortable and you're just not really thinking about it and running the machine up and down. Try not to do that. If your hands stop moving, make sure to stop stitching, or you're going to end up with a little knot on the back of your quilt. So you can see just how easy this is. It just takes a little bit of practice to get the hang of starting and stopping with those curves. But once you get this first one stitched, the first one really is the hardest because you really just need to focus and make sure that your ruler doesn't slip, or if it does slip, you get it back on track. So this first line, I'd say, is the hardest, and then after that line's stitched, everything gets easier from here because it's basically kind of a foundation. We're going to just echo that line, and we're going to echo it using the ruler, and that's going to make it even easier. So I'm going to finish this up, and I'll meet you back here when we're ready to start echoing. So at this stage, we can start quilting anywhere you want to quilt, whether it's from one end or the other. You don't have to quilt from the middle. You just want to take your ruler and take those nice curving grooves that are cut into it. And you want to line up 1 from the edge with the curve you've already stitched. So here we go. I'm just lining that up. And, down here towards the end, it's not going to be real exact. That's okay. The nice thing about these curving lines, it's just like the straight lines. They can flex just a little bit, here and there. And no one's going to take a ruler to your quilt to figure that out. So here I'm just lining up that curve. I'm also making sure my ruler foot's in the down position. And I'm just going to stitch this little segment down to that 1/4 inch mark. But that's such a short little segment. I wonder if I could find a better way of doing that. Just take the ruler and rotate it around, and look, the exact same curve, only now we've got so much more ruler to work with. Isn't that cool? That's the benefit of having the exact same curve cut on both sides of the ruler, like this mini slide. So there we go. I'm just lining up that line And I'm being very careful because this is the side where I have my ruler in my right hand, and I gotta be careful. I gotta think about it because I've also got this needle bar that likes to come down and slam into my thumb. So I want to be real careful. I'm going to stop 1/4 inch from the end, reposition the ruler, and now I'm positioning two things. I'm making sure that it's right up against the ruler foot, and I'm also making sure that curve, one from the edge, is lined up real nice all the way down that stitched line. And now press firmly on the ruler and press against the quilt and slide it through. Now what happens if it's just a little bit off? Like right here I can see that edge line is just not on the line. We'll just shift it over. It's just fine. Sometimes it'll wiggle out of shape just a little bit, and you can, the nice thing is you can kind of fudge it a little bit. It's a-okay. Nothing to worry about. So here we go. I'll do a few more of these. You can see just how fast and easy this is. Beautiful echoing lines like this, these nice even curves, perfectly spaced. Yeah, this is challenging to mark. If you were to mark it and quilt it, that takes a lot more time. You can see how much faster this is just working off of that one single foundational line and using those lines on the ruler to space everything out. So there we go. That is how I'm going to continue filling in all of those beautiful curving lines. And now let's move on to the rest of the background and fill in with some sharp stippling. So I'm on the home stretch now and filling in this background with sharp stippling. So let's go to a very simple version of this design. Very simplest version is just back and forth flame shapes. Just kind of think V shapes. I'm just going to form those all the way down this line. I'm trying to stay away from my echo quilting that I did around the leaves. I'm just trying to stay about 1/4 inch from that just to keep it consistent, and then also because those are two different thread colors and I don't want them to overlap. So that's the simplest way that you can stitch this design. Now let's make it more complex. And you make it more complex by adding extra bends and wiggles. Kind of think long, snaky flame shapes. Something like that. If you get stuck in the design, so like right here, I've got just this little pocket of space left, I want to get back in there and fill that in. So just kind of wiggle in and wiggle back out. That looks great. And stippling, sharp stippling was one of the designs that we used in the leaf shapes. And so it's really nice to take a design that we used in one area of the quilt and then figure out a way of fitting it into the quilt in another way. It just keeps the whole design looking rather consistent. It's really nice. Now if you wanted to, you could also throw in a little bit of paisley shortcut. That would look good too. But I think I'm probably going to fill in this entire background just with sharp stippling. I don't know if I'm going to change thread colors or not. I've got this really bright, wonderful pumpkin isocord thread here. I might just stick with that throughout. It's one of those things that you really just have to play and see, get some thread on your quilt, see what it's looking like. The whole purpose of this project was to create something really fun and beautiful for fall, and I love these colors. They really came out great. I've got a little weird area here, so I want to talk through that. Just going to come in, and I think I'm just going to swirl around in a little spiral. And that's just fine. Anytime you want to put a spiral in your sharp stippling, that's a-okay. If you put a lot of spirals into it, I call that a different design. I call that hot spiral, but that's cool too. And just a subtle way of adding a little bit of extra texture to the design, adding a little bit more of a spirally texture, and that looks great too. And here's what it looked like whenever I finished my Leaf Peepers quilt. So that's it for this video, and that's it for the Leaf Peepers quilt along. I hope that you've had a great time following along as we have pieced and quilted these beautiful quilts together. Now make sure to check out Sherry's final video. You can find it at wholecirclestudio.com. Now, if you're just finding this video and you just ran across it and you're wondering if you can get started now, maybe after the quilt along has been completed, please understand that you can join anytime. all you need is a copy of the quilt pattern. You can find it at leahday.com/leaf. Until next time, let's go quilt.